Reigning from 924 to 939 AD, Athelstan is often regarded as the first true king of England. His ascension marked a significant turning point in English history, as he effectively unified the various Anglo-Saxon kingdoms for the first time under a single ruler. His military skill was highlighted by his famous victory at the Battle of Brunanburh in 937, cementing his control over Northumbria and earning him recognition from lesser kingdoms in Britain and beyond, extending as far as Scotland and even Wales. His was a reign that also saw advancements in law, culture, administration, and included the increased production of coinage and the promotion of learning and religious reform. Thus, Athelstan's efforts to consolidate and enhance the power of the monarchy laid foundational elements for a more recognizable and unified English state, setting up future developments in medieval English governance and identity. Welcome to the channel, my friend. If you're coming here for the first time, great to meet you, and those coming back, great to have you again. Supporting the channel is as easy as enjoying the channel, and you're already doing that, but the like and subscribe is only 2 clicks away, and that helps more people join in on the fun. If you want to go further than that, refer to the video description. But first, with that out of the way, let's all get nice and relaxed. Tonight, we go back to Anglo-Saxon England, those very interesting times, where we encounter a very interesting fellow, Athelstan. Let's set the scene. You see, by the 9th century, the early Anglo-Saxon period's numerous kingdoms had somewhat coalesced into 4 major ones. Now, these 4 kingdoms were as followed: East Anglia, Mercia, Northumbria, and Wessex. Now, of these kingdoms, Mercia was the preeminent one in southern England during the 8th century. However, by the time the 9th century clicked over, Wessex ascended under the leadership of Egbert, who was actually the great-great-grandfather of Athelstan. But this period, however, was not a very nice one for England at all. It was marked by increased Viking hostilities, climaxing with the invasion of the Great Heathen Army in 865, which sounds as bad as it is. Very cool name for an army, though. Now, the Vikings had overrun much of England by 878, you see, including East Anglia, Northumbria, and Mercia. And Wessex, well, they nearly conquered that. They got quite close, until a very pivotal victory at the Battle of Edington under Alfred the Great. I have a full video on him if you want to go and watch it, but let's continue on first. Now, Alfred's triumph led to a division of territories, with western Mercia returning to Anglo-Saxon control, and eastern Mercia, well, they fell under this Viking rule. In the 890s, Alfred, alongside his son Edward and Ethelred, Lord of the Mercians, repelled even more Viking attacks, though they were all quite costly battles for both sides. Ethelred, who was married to Alfred's daughter, Æthelflæd, managed English Mercia under Alfred and continued until his death in 899, when Edward ascended the throne. Now, things remained relatively stable until 909, 10 years later, when Edward decided to orchestrate a raid into Northumbria. The retaliation by Northumbrian Danes in 910 was met with defeat at the Battle of Tettenhall. Upon Ethelred's death in 911, Æthelflaed took over Mercian rule. She and Edward managed to achieve significant victories, reclaiming Viking-held territories in Mercia and East Anglia, until her death some 7 years later, in the year 918. Edward then deposed her daughter, Æthelstan, unifying Mercia directly under his rule. Edward's death in 924, however, left a dominion that encompassed all of England south of the Humber River. Meanwhile, the Kingdom of York was under the rule of the Viking king Sihtric, with Ealdred maintaining Anglo-Saxon presence in the northern parts of Northumbria. As for Scotland, well, that was largely under Constantine II's rule, except for the southwest, which was governed by the British Kingdom of Strathclyde. And Wales? Well, that was a little bit more complicated. It remained divided among several smaller kingdoms. Now, speaking of our sources at the time, we have a good one, and that's William of Malmesbury, and he records that Aethelstan was around 30 years old when he ascended the throne in 924, indicating a birth year of about 894. He was the eldest son of Edward the Elder, born to Edward's first consort, Aegwin, a woman shrouded in quite a bit of mystery due to the scant contemporary records about her. Now, medieval chroniclers varied in their portrayal of her status. Some suggested that she was simply of low birth, while others claimed that she actually was from noble lineage. Well, today it's still a little bit divisive. Some propose that Æthelstan's initial unpopularity may have stemmed from perceptions of his mother as a concubine, whereas others argue there is significant evidence to doubt her legitimacy as Edward's wife, speculating she might have been related to St. Dunstan. Complicated stuff, isn't it? Well, William of Malmesbury also recounts an episode where Alfred the Great honored a young Athelstan with a scarlet cloak, a jeweled belt, and a sword in a gilded scabbard. Beautiful gifts, and certainly very expensive. Not given lightly, that's for sure. Now, this is interpreted by some scholars as signaling Æthelstan's potential for succession. This was especially significant given the threat posed by Æthelwold to Alfred's direct descendants. However, it's also suggested by one Janet Nelson that this might have been an attempt by Alfred to balance power between his son and grandson, while others even speculating that Alfred may have preferred Æthelstan as his successor. Well, an acrostic poem that we have from the time praising one Adelstan, spelled A-D-A-L, and his promising future has been associated with Æthelstan, of course, seen as a commemoration of Alfred's gift, and possibly written by Alfred's scholar John the Old Saxon. Now, there are some who support the view, of course, suggesting John as Æthelstan's tutor, but it may also be that the poem likely dates from the start of Æthelstan's reign. Either way. Now, Edward the Elder, after the death of his father, married his second wife, Aelfled, around the time he became king, following the death or possible sidelining of Aegwin. and this marriage certainly complicated matters for Æthelstan, as Æthelflæd may have favored her own sons, Ælfweard and Edwin. Edward later married a third time to Eadgifu, who bore him future kings Edmund and Eadred, among other children. Now, how was the growing up for Æthelstan? Well, he was raised largely at the Mercian court, under his aunt Æthelflæd and her husband Æthelred, where he likely developed those military skills that come quite a bit in handy when you have to fight the Vikings, of course. His close ties to Mercia were also evident in 925, when he granted privileges to St. Odwald's Priory in Gloucester, fulfilling a promise to Æthelred. Following Æthelflæd's death in 918, Æthelstan possibly represented his father's interests in Mercia, further strengthening those regional connections. Now, Edward the Elder's death in July of 924 in Farndon near Mercia made things quite complex in terms of succession. Although Edward's eldest son by his second wife Æthelflæd, Ælfweard, was prominently featured in royal charters, suggesting preparation for kingship, it's unclear whether Edward intended for Ælfweard to rule just Wessex or the entire kingdom. And of course, that's where the debate began. Edward's actions in 918, including removing Æthelflæd's daughter Ælfwine from power in Mercia, might have been a preparatory strike for Æthelstan's eventual rule there, set the scene for him so he can shoehorn him into power. Well, at the time of Edward's death, Æthelstan, being in Mercia, quickly secured support as king there, while Ælfweard was possibly recognized in Wessex. However, Ælfweard did not last too long. In fact, he died 16 days later, which made the succession even more complicated. Now, in Wessex there was a bit of resistance to Æthelstan, particularly in Winchester, where Ælfweard was buried. Initially, Æthelstan's rule seemed confined to the region of Mercia, as a 925 Derbyshire land charter that we have, witnessed only by Mercian bishops, indicates his authority was not yet acknowledged beyond Mercia. Now, a few modern historians have speculated that Æthelstan might have vowed to remain unmarried and childless to secure his position, reflecting a kind of political prudence. In contrast, one historian, Sarah Foote, attributes his unmarried status more to a personal choice. After all, he was quite devout. Religious chastity was certainly up there on the list. Well, we finally get to the coronation of Athelstan, which was September the 4th, 925. He was coronated in Kingston upon Thames. Now, upon Thames basically means on the River Thames. So it's a way that they name their towns in England. Now, that was a location strategically between Wessex and Mercia, and it symbolized the unity that he sought. A halfway point, a little bit from column A and column B. Now, the ceremony was led by Archbishop Athelm of Canterbury, possibly introduced a new coronation rite that replaced traditional helmets with a crown, and incorporated elements of West Frankish liturgy, marking a significant shift in royal ceremonies. and of course influencing subsequent European rites. Post-coronation, resistance to Æthelstan's rule continued. Not everybody was keen to get on board with this new ruler. Once more we have from William of Malmesbury, who recounts a conspiracy by a noble named Alfred to blind Aethelstan, a move motivated by claims of illegitimacy, and of course intended to disqualify him from kingship without resorting to murder. Well, let's be honest. If you're going to do that and you get caught blinding the potential king, you're going to be put up on the rack anyway. You may as well finish the job. I don't really understand the logic behind that. Well, his choice. Either way, the exact motives behind the plot, whether they'd be personal ambition, or perhaps on behalf of Æthelstan's half-brother Edwin, well, that's another matter of speculation. Now, back in Winchester, signs of discord persisted on and on. Bishop Æthelstan of Winchester was notably absent from Athelstan's coronation, and abstained from signing Æthelstan's charters until 928. When he did begin witnessing charters, his name was positioned lower than his seniority would traditionally suggest, sort of shoved to the side. Of course, another indication of the ongoing tensions. Now, 933. Æthelstan's half-brother Edwin died in a shipwreck off the North Sea. Edwin's cousin, Adolf, the Count of Boulogne, transported his body for burial at St. Bertin's Abbey in Saint-Omer. Folcuin, the abbey's annalist, mistakenly believed Edwin had been king, and speculated that he fled England due to all of the problems and strife. He recorded that Athelstan sent offerings to the abbey for Edwin, and welcomed its monks warmly on their visit to England in 944, though he was mistaken about Athelstan being alive at the time. Well, despite later sources like Simeon of Durham suggesting that Athelstan ordered Edwin's execution by throwing him in the lake and drowning him, most historians reject this and believe that Edwin may have attempted a rebellion, and when it failed, he simply fled, his death marking an end to all of the major opposition from the region of Winchester. Well, after conquering the Danish-held territories of East Mercia and East Anglia, with the support of Aethelflaed and her husband Aethelred, Edward the Elder's death created a power vacuum. The Viking kingdom of York, under Danish King Sihtric, remained independent from English control, for now. Well, in January 926, Æthelstan strategically arranged his sister's marriage to Sihtric, forming a non-aggression pact. That was just the way things were done. Traditional marriage, a little too traditional. Well, however, Sihtric's death in 927, only a year later, opened an opportunity for Æthelstan, who then defeated Sihtric's cousin Guthfrith and captured York, securing the submission of its Danish population whether they liked it or not. And thus his expansion into the north marked the first time that a southern king had controlled the region, initially facing resistance from the Northumbrians. By July 12, 927, at Aymont near Penrith, he had secured the allegiance of several northern and western rulers, leading to 7 years of much welcome peace. He also affirmed his authority over the Welsh kingdoms of Gwent, Gwynedd, and Deheubarth, continuing his lordship established by Æthelfled and Edward. At a significant meeting in Hereford after Aymont, he imposed a substantial tribute on the Welsh kings and set the River Wye as the boundary between England and Wales. Notably, Hywel Dda of Deheubarth and other Welsh kings regularly were visitors to Æthelstan's court, and they enjoyed a high status and welcomed the sustained peace between England and Wales during the reign, despite a little bit of lingering resentment over subjugation. But I suppose it's far better to be subjugated than dead, depending on who you ask. Well, once more William of Malmesbury chimes in to suggest that Aethelstan expelled the Cornish from Exeter and fortified the city, setting the river Tamar as Cornwall's boundary. However, this is once again debated by historians such as Thomas Charles Edwards and John Davies, who view it as improbable or perhaps indicative of suppressing a revolt. Æthelstan further integrated Cornwall by establishing a new bishopric, maintaining the region's distinct culture and language. And thus his reign is recognized as the beginning of we may call it an imperial phase in English kingship, lasting all the way from 925 to 975, during which the Anglo-Saxon people were united as much as they could be, and he was acknowledged as the overlord of Britain. The period saw rulers from Wales and Scotland participating in English assemblies and signing their charters. Now, to secure his rule in Northumbria, as that was the difficult spot, Æthelstan sought the favour of the local aristocracy by donating gifts to the ministers of Beverley, Chester-le-Street, and York, showing once again his commitment to Christianity, proving that he was a good boy in the eyes of the church, and everybody likes that. Well, he also gained the large territory of Amunderness in Lancashire, which he gifted to the Archbishop of York, boosting the Archbishop's role as his chief representative in the region. But despite all of this, Æthelstan was still viewed as an outsider in the north. No matter what he did, he was always the southerner. It was a place where the local British kingdoms often preferred alliances with Norse pagans from Dublin over southern control. That ought to tell you something. Of course, Dublin, Ireland was indeed at a time a very famous stronghold of the Norsemen. But his authority was solid in southern Britain. Now in 934, Æthelstan led a military campaign further north into Scotland, sparked by multiple factors, including the death of his half-brother Edwin in 933, and the regional instability following the death of Guthfrith, the Norse king of Dublin. Another potential catalyst was the death of Ealdred of Bamberg, hinting at territorial disputes with Constantine. This campaign, which the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, do recommend reading that, records without specifying causes, was mentioned by John of Worcester as being provoked entirely by Constantine's treaty violation. And that's a casus belli to attack, if there ever was one. While setting out in May 934 with 4 Welsh kings and a retinue including 18 bishoprics and 13 earls, Æthelstan advanced to Chester-le-Street by late June or perhaps early July. There, he donated several items and gave gifts to St. Cuthbert's tomb, that were initially meant for Bishop Æthelstan of Winchester. The campaign involved land forces reaching as far north as Brunanburh in northeast Scotland, and they were accompanied by naval forces, who were mainly targeting Caithness. Although the chronicles don't detail battles or specific outcomes, we do know that by September of 934, Aethelstan had returned to southern England, as evidenced by a charter witnessed in Buckingham by Constantine as a subordinate king. In 935, Constantine and Owain of Strathclyde's acknowledgement of Aethelstan's supremacy was reaffirmed in a charter. That Christmas, Owain and the Welsh kings attended Aethelstan's court, although notably, Constantine was nowhere to be found. 934. Olaf Guthfrithson became the Norse king of Dublin following the death of Guthfrith, and strengthened ties with the Scots through marriage to Constantine's daughter. By August of 937, after securing his position in Ireland, Olaf aimed to reclaim the former Norse kingdom of York. The alliance of Olaf, Constantine, and the Strathclyde Britons under Owain posed a significant challenge and a threat to Æthelstan. Thus, a late-year campaign was prompted, which was quite unusual for military operations. Usually you rest in the winter. But of course, desperate times, desperate measures. You do what you have to do. Now initially he had a slow response, and he was widely criticized for it. But Æthelstan's strategic patience was later seen as quite prudent. A great contrast with King Harold's rushed approach in 1066, but that's another story, the Battle of Hastings. Now he carefully prepared his forces, composed of West Saxons and Mercians, for conflict. Notably, the Welsh remained neutral during this unfolding conflict. And thus we arrive at the Battle of Brunanburh, which was a decisive clash that culminated in a significant triumph for Aethelstan, one that's still talked about today. Well, Aethelstan was of course joined by his youthful half-brother, who was the future King Edmund, and he did his part too. Let's not write him off. But despite achieving victory, the English forces endured considerable losses, including two cousins of Aethelstan, both sons of Edward the Elder's younger brother, Aethelweard. Olaf managed to retreat to Dublin with the remnants of his forces, while Constantine suffered the personal loss of a son. The battle's magnitude are quite vividly captured in an account from the Annals of Ulster, and I'll read it now. A great lamentable and horrible battle was cruelly fought between the Saxons and Northmen, in which several thousands of Northmen, who are uncounted, fell, but their king, Olaf, escaped with a few followers. A large number of Saxons fell on the other side, but Æthelstan, king of the Saxons, enjoyed a great victory. While reflecting on this event years later, the chronicler Aethelweard referred to it as the Great Battle, a confrontation that solidified Æthelstan's legacy as, and I quote, victorious because of God, a phrase coined by the homilist Aelfric of Eynsham. Now the Anglo-Saxon chronicle seemed to deviate from its customary concise narrative to include a heroic poem that extolled his significant victory, and it cast Aethelstan in the most glorious and imperial terms as this ruler of all of Britannia. The precise location, however, of the Battle of Brunanburh, well, that we don't quite know, at least for now. In fact, there's over 30 proposed sites. The one that's most supported by historians, however, is Brunanburh on the Wirral. At least for now. It may change later. We'll see. Don't yell at me if you're watching this in 2030 when we've found 10,000 dead Vikings under the ground somewhere. Now, of course, it's not just the location that's debatable. It's the significance. Some have actually critiqued it as a Pyrrhic victory for Aethelstan, which effectively means that you lose so much, it's the victory so costly, that it's hardly a victory at all. You know, when you see a boxing match and both of them look equally hurt, well, it's kind of like that. Either way, they suggest that despite the immediate success, his influence waned and his control over Northumbria was briefly contested upon his death. Now there is one other historian, Alfred Smith, who lauds the event as, I quote, the greatest battle in Anglo-Saxon history. And I'm quite inclined to agree with him. But maybe the impact has been somewhat exaggerated in the broader scope of history. But I do think it's up there. Contrarily, Sarah Foote, we've mentioned her earlier in the essay, she argues for its critical importance as well, suggesting that if Aethelstan was defeated, they would have likely shattered Anglo-Saxon dominance over Britain, and the whole show would have come to an end. Then who knows what things would have been like. Well, in the 9th century in general, Anglo-Saxon governance relied heavily on what was called ealdormen, who held the highest lay status beneath the king, the second in command. Think of it like that. Initially, each ealdorman managed just one shire within Wessex, but by the mid-10th century, their dominions had expanded significantly. This expansion, likely initiated by Aethelstan to better administer his enlarged kingdom, saw ealdormen overseeing broader territories. Among these ealdormen was one also named Aethelstan, who governed East Anglia, the largest and wealthiest province in England at the time. And in fact, his considerable power earned him quite an interesting nickname, Æthelstan, the Half-King. Well, it's more of a king than I will be. Well, many ealdormen of this period had Scandinavian names too, because of course, well, it suggests that they were political successors of the earls who had commanded Danish forces under Edward the Elder. Æthelstan retained these leaders, of course, integrating them instead of getting rid of them, having them join into his system of local governance as representatives across the regions that they formerly commanded. Beneath the ealdormen were the reeves, local noble landowners tasked with overseeing towns or royal estates. Now, in general, the early medieval period, the roles of the church and state were, well, the church was the state. To an extent, they were quite intertwined. Lay officials like the reeves collaborated quite closely with ecclesiastical leaders, including diocesan bishops and local abbots. These church figures also played significant roles in the king's councils, showing again the integrated nature of religious and secular authority in governance during the era. Now, as the first ruler to unify all the Anglo-Saxon peoples, Aethelstan established a centralized governance system, enhancing administrative structures inherited from those before him, but this time with a more increased and broad royal oversight. And just goes to show during 928 and 935, when scribe Æthelstan A exclusively produced detailed charters that included precise dates, locations, and extensive witness lists, showing the king's direct control over bureaucratic functions. After this period, the complexity of charters seemed to have been reduced, indicating the scribe's unique influence on their detail. Æthelstan's governance also centered around the King's Council, or the Witan as it was called. Unlike predecessors who had travelled extensively, Æthelstan primarily stayed in Wessex, managing his realm by summoning influential figures to his councils quite regularly, doing checkups when he needed to. These larger and more inclusive assemblies featured bishops, ealdormen, thanes, and magnates, effectively reducing regional isolation and fostering national unity. The Anglo-Saxons were also early adopters of using the vernacular for administrative documents in northern Europe, a practice dating back to Ethelbert of Kent in the early 7th century. By the end of the 9th century, Alfred the Great had fully codified the laws into Old English, influenced by Carolingian models of earlier times. These laws covered governance areas like treason and judicial ordeals, serving as a foundation for later legal developments under kings like Aethelstan. Æthelstan's reign produced a significant volume of its own legal texts. In fact, more than any other 10th century English monarch. These included his tithe edict and the Ordinance on Charities, along with other codes established at royal councils, local legal texts from London and Kent, and possibly the Dunsat regulations also date from his era. Now, if there was one problem at the time of Aethelstan, it was robbery. It was everywhere. Aethelstan had to do something about this, of course, so he initiated stern legal reforms. Basically, if you got caught stealing, they were going to kill you. Such as the Great Lees Code's death penalty for thieves stealing items over 8 pence, which isn't really that much. While recognizing the ineffectiveness of harsh penalties, he later introduced an amnesty in the Exeter Code for thieves who compensated their victims, aiming to reduce the protection criminals received from influential relatives, and this seemed to be a bit of a better option. But the leniency was unfortunately short-lived, well, for the criminals at least, and by the Thunderfield Council, Aethelstan reverted to stricter penalties, albeit he did make adjustments, such as raising the minimum age for capital punishment to 15, reflecting his reluctance to impose the death penalty on the young for minor offences. Still, imagine a 15-year-old being executed for, I don't know, stealing somebody's pie cooling off on the windowsill. I don't think they had that in Anglo-Saxon England, but think of the equivalent. Well, during his reign, Æthelstan also introduced the system of tithing, and that's a collective responsibility model, of sorts, I suppose, where groups of 10 or more ensured local peace, a precursor to the frank pledge system of later times. Now, historian Sarah Foote points out that Æthelstan's unique approach linked theft directly to disloyalty towards his rule, a perspective not mirrored in the legislation of other monarchs. His focus on theft in particular and its root causes was indicative of his broader commitment to maintaining order and loyalty across the lands. But there is a bit of a divide on the efficacy and coherence of his legal efforts. There are critiques of his laws as having a gulf dividing its exalted aspirations from the spasmodic impact, as Patrick Warmold says, describing the legislative output as somewhat chaotic and, moreover, ineffective. Conversely, there's others such as Simon Keynes, who laud the laws of Aethelstan, especially the Greatly Code, as, quote, an impressive piece of legislation that underscored the king's resolve to uphold social order despite the challenges of governing a restive populace. Well, we find ourselves now in the 970s, with King Edgar, Æthelstan's nephew, who implemented significant reforms in the monetary system of Anglo-Saxon England, establishing a sophisticated and high-quality silver currency that was both uniform as it was plentiful, making it the most advanced in Europe at the time, a system that was a stark contrast to the less developed monetary conditions under Athelstan, where coinage was still largely organized on a regional basis, despite the unification of the country. Now we've mentioned the Greatly Code, which is credited to Æthelstan, which mandated a unified coinage throughout his domain, echoing an earlier decree from his father's era that applied mainly to southern towns like London and Kent. Initially, various coin styles circulated within Æthelstan's realm. However, after his conquest of York and securing allegiance from other British kings, he introduced the circumscription cross coinage. This new coin bore the inscription Rex Totius Britanniae, or King of all Britain, and it was minted in Wessex, English Mercia, and York under the title Rex Saxorum, which I'm pretty sure you can guess what that means, King of the Saxons. Oh, and by the way, this coinage did not extend to East Anglia or the Danelaw. If you don't know what the Danelaw is, watch my video on the Vikings in England. You'll find out. Now, by the early 930s, as we go back in time a little bit, Aethelstan issued the crowned bust type of coin, featuring him with a crown for the first time. And this design was rampant across all regions, except for Mercia, where coins continued to lack the portrait of a ruler. What does that mean? Well, it would suggest a diminishing goodwill towards Aethelstan, in the area where he was raised, nonetheless. Well, during his reign, the integration of church and state in Anglo-Saxon England, of course, deepened. As we've noted, he was exceedingly pious. Well, this trend was especially pronounced after Edward the Elder annexed Mercia, elevating the Archbishopric of Canterbury's influence. Æthelstan's victories further extended this influence, placing the Northern Church under Southern control for the first time. Æthelstan's court also nurtured future ecclesiastical leaders, pivotal in the Benedictine monastic reform under King Edgar. Dunstan and Aethelward, key reform figures, began their ecclesiastical careers right there in Æthelstan's court. with Æthelwold spending significant time at the royal palace, gaining knowledge from the king's wise men, as his biographer Wulfstan recounts. Additionally, Odo, later Archbishop of Canterbury, initially served as Bishop of Ramsbury, appointed directly by Athelstan. Now, he was also renowned for collecting religious relics. Athelstan valued them, as noted by the abbot of St. Samson in Dol, as more than an earthly treasure, and his contributions extended beyond relics. He was generous benefactor of manuscripts to churches and monasteries. Among his notable commissions was the Lives of Cuthbert by Bede for the community at Chester-le-Street, featuring the earliest known manuscript portrait of an English king. And his religious influence also extended abroad, fostering ties with continental churches. This was exemplified when Kenwald, a royal priest who later became Bishop of Worcester, escorted two of Æthelstan's half-sisters to the Saxon court for a marriage alliance with the future Holy Roman Emperor Otto. Cenwald's subsequent tour of German monasteries, where he distributed gifts from Athelstan and secured commitments for prayers, strengthened the cultural and religious bonds between Saxony and England. And these ties were further cemented by the frequent correspondence and exchanges that spread the ideas about monastic reform from the continent to England. Now, among the eminent intellectuals of Æthelstan's court was Israel the Grammarian, possibly of Breton origin, known for his scholarly contributions. Alongside a Frankish colleague, Israel created Gospel Dice, a board game presented to Irish Bishop Dubh Ince, showing the intellectual and cultural exchanges prevalent at Æthelstan's court. Such interactions also showed the king's significant role in laying the groundwork for the English monastic reform that flourished later. While few prose narratives from Æthelstan's era have survived, the period was rich in its poetry, including the epic poem Brunanburh. In fact, it's been suggested that the iconic Old English epic Beowulf may have indeed originated from within Æthelstan's scholarly circle, indicating the king's profound impact on both ecclesiastical and cultural circles. And his court revived a complex and ornate style of Latin writing too, reminiscent of West Saxon scholar Eldhelm, and influenced by early 10th century French monasticism. Key figures like the aforementioned Israel the Grammarian led this revival, using lengthy, intricate sentences, obscure words, and new coined terms. All perfectly cromulent, I'm sure. This period also introduced the Aethelstan A charters that we mentioned, noted for their elaborate Latin, which Simon Keynes linked to Æthelstan's unification of England, signifying both intellectual achievement and the monarchy's embodiment of a new political power. Now, debate exists over Æthelstan's use of titles like Rex Totius Britanniae, King of all Britain, on his coins and charters. Some view these as overreaching, while others argue that they were fitting and reflected the broad hegemony that he had. Æthelstan's court maintained connections also with the Carolingian dynasty, with ties reinforced through marriages and traditions. In fact, his coronation included Carolingian anointment rituals, and his coinage introduced that crowned bust design, which was originally Carolingian iconography, a novel portrayal in Anglo-Saxon minting. He also received considerable praise abroad. French chronicler Flodoard called him, I quote, the king from overseas, and the Annals of Ulster described him as the pillar of the dignity of the Western world. It's quite a review, isn't it? Modern historians also laud him. Michael Wood, in the work The Making of King Æthelstan's Empire, an English Charlemagne, views him as Britain's most formidable ruler since the Roman times. There is also another, Veronica Ortenberg, who considers him the most powerful ruler in Europe, akin to a Carolingian emperor, putting him up there with Charlemagne. Well, she noted that while most continental dynasties faced military strife and internal conflict in the 920s, Æthelstan's military successes allowed him to surpass the reputation of a great heroic dynasty of warrior kings and develop a Carolingian ideology of kingship. Well, it couldn't last forever, of course, and we reached the end of Æthelstan's life on October 27th, 939, in Gloucester. Unlike his forebears who were buried in Winchester, Æthelstan chose Malmesbury Abbey in Wiltshire, interring his cousins there who had died at the Battle of Brunanburh. Following Æthelstan's death, power dynamics in northern England once again shifted. York's inhabitants chose Olaf Guthfrithson, the King of Dublin, as their ruler, challenging Anglo-Saxon dominance in the region and initiating a period of struggle for Æthelstan's half-brothers, Edmund and Eadred, who focused their reigns from 939 to 955 on reclaiming and trying to stabilize the Anglo-Saxon authority. Olaf Guthrisson's takeover extended all the way to the East Midlands, prompting the establishment of a new frontier along Watling Street. His death in 941 provided another opportunity for Edmund, who regained the East Midlands in 942, and after 2 years, rather hard fought, he successfully recaptured York. But he didn't get to enjoy it for very long. York fell under Viking control once again after Edmund's death in 946 a few years later, and thus the region remained contested until 954, when the Northumbrians expelled their last Norwegian Viking ruler, Eric Bloodaxe. This event led to the Northumbrians shrugging their shoulders and simply submitting to King Eadred, restoring complete Anglo-Saxon control over all of England. And the wheels keep turning, don't they? Well, thank you very much for listening to the life of Aethelstan, the king of the Anglo-Saxons. Quite an interesting character. Rex totius Britanniae, Engla-Ginning. Well, I'd like to thank my top-tier patrons. That's Britt, Charles, Stark Factory, JC, Jeffrey, Wendy, Ben, Dark, Scott, Aaron, James, and Tim. Thank you kindly for supporting the channel through Patreon and memberships. If you'd like to do the same, you know what to do. But make sure you have a good rest, and start the day with a big glass of water. That always seems to help. Good night, everyone. Lots of love to you all.